Hello and welcome to Module 2 of our short course on risk assessment for food safety. Module 2 will cover the basic concepts in food safety risk assessment. It'll orient you to the use of terms and also provide some examples in the food safety context. So before we started digging into risk assessment, I wanted to show you this figure that's on the screen, which is really the whole breadth of risk analysis. And risk analysis is a broader term that incorporates these elements. So first, risk assessment, which is the science-based piece of risk analysis, which is what we're going to be talking about today and over the rest of this short course. There's also another part of risk analysis is risk management, which in this package of courses, we have another short course on risk management. And then around each of those elements, risk assessment and risk management, risk communication is an important component. We do not have a short course on risk communication in this area, but I wanted to let you know that it is a part of the broader term of risk analysis. So we have two pretty basic learning objectives for this module, which should take about less than 10 minutes for you to listen to. So the first is to know the definition of risk, the technical way that we talk about this term, and then understand this application in the area of food safety. So first, just an introduction to this idea of using risk in food safety. I think most of you probably have some background in food safety already, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of how we're thinking about food safety. Food safety talks about when the fact that if food is not produced safely or handled correctly, it can make you sick. There's many different types of things that can cause human illness, which we'll talk about in another module. But for now, we'll just call any food that can make you sick contaminated food. So for each contaminated food situation, we can use scientific knowledge to estimate how likely a person is to get sick from this food, and then how bad it will be if they get sick. That is, will it be a short-term stomach ache? Will it cause the person to miss a couple of days of work? Could it cause hospitalization or potential long-term health complications, or even could it cause death? So that's the severity part of the measure. So how bad will it be if they do get sick? So how likely that they will get sick, and then how bad it will be if they do get sick. And these two concepts together is what we mean when we say risk. So there's three important questions when we talk about risk assessment. One is what can go wrong? So that's the part where you're really identifying what the hazards are. That's part of step one of this risk assessment process. So we'll be talking about that in another module in this course. How likely is it to happen? So this is the likelihood part or probability part. So this includes both step 2 exposure assessment and step 3 hazard characterization. So there'll be modules on both of those steps as well in this short course. And then finally, if it does happen, how bad will it be? And that's step 4, risk characterization. So we'll go through the rest of the modules on this course. We'll be covering each of those steps in turn. So basically, risk is something that gives you information about what could go wrong. So I'm sure that you're familiar with this idea of risk being applied in many other situations besides food safety. It can also be applied in the environmental world, things that could go wrong in the environment, water quality, air quality, soil quality, things like that. You can apply risk assessment to financial problems in terms of how much could be lost and how bad could it be if you lost financial resources. Energy, there's many different domains in which risk assessment concepts are used, and they all use the same basic definition, which is that there's these two concepts. One is the probability of an adverse impact, which is the likelihood part, and then the other one is how bad it would be if it happened, and that's the severity part of the outcome. So when we talk about risk information, it's described as the statement about the likelihood and severity of harm. So coming back to food safety again, I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of food safety statements that are very different in time and scope and scale, and it gives you an idea of how you can kind of see the likelihood and severity piece in these statements and how it can be applied to food safety. So the first statement is one from the WHO Global Burden of Foodborne Illness Estimates, where 31 food hazards were identified to cause 600 million illnesses and 420,000 deaths in 2010. So the severity part is the illnesses and death, and the likelihood part is 600 million out of everyone in the world, and that gives you the sense of how likely that was. So that's a very high level risk estimate. The second point is a very narrow risk estimate. It's about a specific type of exposure to a specific type of pathogen, which is the E. coli. So in E. coli exposures, 10% of those who are exposed to E. coli 0157H7 or other Shiga producing E. coli, so specific types of hazards, 10% of those people will develop HUS, hemolytic uremic syndrome, which is a severe life-threatening complication. So that gives you risk information because it's telling you what percent of the people will have this severe outcome. So it both has the likelihood and severity. And then the last piece is an example from the United States risk assessment, which was about deli meat, and they were looking at the Listeria pathogen, and they wanted to know what percent of the exposures from this Listeria pathogen, what percent of the exposures in the United States are due to deli meat. And the risk assessment estimated that 90% of those cases were due to deli meat. So again, you can see the likelihood and the severity type of part to this. The severity isn't as specific here, but it's more all the health outcomes from Listeria. 90% of them come from deli meat. So these are all, very good risk statements in the food safety realm, and you can see they can have different kinds of scope and scale. Some of them are just specific foods, some of them are specific pathogens, some of them are much broader. So when you're doing a risk assessment, you need to think about which what's the scope and scale of the risk assessment that you're working on. And these are all good examples to refer back to. So before we get into kind of the how-to of risk assessments, which we'll cover in the next several modules, I wanted to give a little background just to kind of orient you to why we do risk assessments and who might be working on them. So risk assessments, if you were able to view the short course on risk-based decision-making first, you would have heard about this already. They're really, they're used to estimate risk to inform decision-making. So the example we have here is that if you have an intervention that's been developed and say it reduces contamination in a particular food by 20%. So you could estimate then the impact of that reduction. So you would say you can't just say if we reduce the contamination by 20%, then the illnesses will go down by 20%, because there's a lot of modeling that goes in there to connect those two. So if you reduce the contamination by 20%, then you would need to estimate, okay, how much would that actually reduce the illnesses? And how much would it reduce the likelihood, and how much would it reduce the severity? And so that's an example of how you might want to, if you're trying to decide if you should introduce this intervention or not, you would want to know, well, how much is it going to actually impact the outcome that I care about? And you would need a risk assessment to create those estimates. You might also use risk assessments to identify what part of the value chain contributes to the contamination. So say you're looking at a certain kind of food that on average has a certain level of contamination, and you want to identify what part of the process from the farm to the table was causing this contamination. So you can look at the processing steps, and you can look at the production, and you can look at the transportation and the handling, and all these things that could either increase or decrease contamination, and you could figure out where's the right place to intervene for the pathogen. So for example, if the contamination is happening at the processing plant, then cleaning up things at the growing stage wouldn't necessarily help reduce that. So it's important to know when you're making decisions about where to intervene in the value chain, where the right place is, to be able to understand where the contamination is being added to the foods. So again, risk assessments are used to inform risk management decisions, and they can also be used to identify data needs. So if you try to do a risk assessment, you decide you want to know about something, and there's a lot of data missing, so you have to make a lot of assumptions, you could identify future needs in terms of improving that data so that better estimates can be made. In terms of who might conduct these risk assessments, there's many different organizations that are making these decisions. Decisions like government agencies, food producers, retail and restaurants, consumers, and other parts of the value chain. So these are the people that are making the decisions. So ideally, these people have the risk information available, but it's not always these organizations that produce the risk assessments. In our experience, traditionally, the people that are developing risk assessments are either government agencies, is very common, nonprofit agencies maybe that are trying to support a certain decision process, universities, and also consumer and advocacy organizations might do these. So these are the places where kind of the resources could be available to conduct these risk assessments, so the decision makers would have the information that they need. So these again are the 4 steps in risk assessment that I mentioned earlier. So the hazard identification step talks about what is the hazard that is of concern. The exposure assessment talks about what is the chance of exposure and what is the level of exposure. Hazard characterization is about the dose response function, or how people's health outcomes respond based on exposure to this contaminant. And then finally, the risk characterization kind of brings it all together. So again, we're going to have a module on each one of these steps to give you examples and talk you through some of those processes that are needed to conduct a risk assessment. So as I mentioned earlier, when we looked at those 3 examples of risk statements, they're very different in terms of scope and scale and what they included and what they did not include. And so when conducting a risk assessment, it's really important to define the purpose. There's many types of risks that any organization might be concerned about, but it's important to make sure that you've identified that the scope, we might call it, the list of things that the risk assessment will include, because otherwise you'll get stuck in trying to kind of include everything. And it's really more important to make sure the decision maker, the person who will be using these risk results, and the analyst, the person who's running the models and creating the models, that they're on the same page in terms of what's needed. It's not unusual for there to be kind of different approaches there, and it's only going to really help the decision maker if those 2 people are aligned in terms of how they're approaching the problem. So this idea of scope really defines what's included in the risk assessment. For example, you might only focus on one food or one food category, maybe milk or maybe dairy, or you might include only a certain number of pathogens or a certain type of pathogens. So depending on what your purpose is and what your decision process is and what things you need to do next, you might choose different scopes. But I will mention that risk assessments are very labor intensive generally, and so it's important to make sure that you have the right scope before you get too far along. And I just want to add a few context about kind of why food safety, and these are comments about the Codex Alimentarius Commission Codex, which has kind of embraced risk assessment as its approach. So it's something that gives people the information that they need to make decisions, and Codex supports this type of approach. So after viewing this module, hope that you are now familiar with the definition of risk and that you are able to easily bring to mind some examples of risk assessment in food safety decision making.